Hello, everybody, and welcome to our professional development webinar series. Our goal in this series is to provide parish ministers and volunteers and diocesan ministers the formation training and the tools they need to create vibrant Catholic parishes and growing ministries. Today's webinar, Rebuilding Your Message with Father Michael White and Tom Corcoran, is going to provide you with the tools you need to effectively communicate with your parish. My name is Jared Dees. I'm the moderator for the webinar series. I'm the digital marketing manager at Ave Maria Press. I want to take a quick moment to recognize the partners in this series: the National Conference for Catechetical Leadership, the National Association for Lay Ministry, and the National Federation of Priest Councils. Everyone in the audience is muted, but you are able to ask questions, and questions may be sent to our presenters in the question section of the GoToWebinar panel, which you can see displayed on the screen here. I'll read as many of those questions as possible at the end of the presentation today. This webinar is being recorded, and a link to the recording will be sent out to you later on this week via email. So you're welcome to share that with the rest of your staff as well. So with that, I'd like to make a quick welcome to our presenters, Father Michael White and Tom Corcoran. Father White is a priest of the Archdiocese of Baltimore and the pastor of the Church of the Nativity in Timonium, Maryland. And Tom Corcoran is the associate to the pastor of Church of the Nativity, along with Father White. And he is the co-author, or they are the co-authors of Rebuilt, Tools for Rebuilding, and the new Rebuilding Your Message. So those books have combined sales of more than 100,000 copies in just the last 2 years. So we've been really excited about the success, and most of all for the growing movement that the two of you have brought to the church. So with that, Father Michael and Tom, welcome, and thanks for being here back to our series, or coming back to our series.
Thanks, Jared. Great to be with you. Thanks, Jared.
Here you go. Feel free to take the screen over and pull up your presentation.
I will do that. Good. Well, hello, wherever you are, and hope your day is going well. This is a positive contribution to it. White, and I'm here with Tom. We're talking today about our book, Rebuilding Your Message. And I like to say right up front, this is not a book about preaching for preachers, nor is it a book about teaching for teachers. It's not a book about marketing for marketers. This is a book about communication for communicators who sometimes preach, often teach, and are constantly in sales. It's about communication of the most important message ever, the gospel of Jesus Christ. This is a book about communication of that life-changing message that lies at the heart of our church within the local congregation that Catholics call their parish. We're two guys who have been involved in nearly every aspect of parish life and leadership. In the process, we've come to understand that all of it is fundamentally about sharing the Word of God. At the same time, we've grown aware of how difficult it is to get any message across in our noisy, crowded culture. We've also developed some understanding about how increasingly indifferent, at times hostile, that culture is to what we have to say. Lastly, for now, we've learned that when ministers and leaders get communication wrong in the life of a parish, a lot else goes wrong too. And growth follow. We address this topic in our book, Rebuilt, which argues that the message matters when it comes to the life of a parish. In Tools for Rebuilding, we offered a lot of ideas for communicating, especially when the form of communication is preaching. We've been heartened by the positive response those books have received, leading us to try our hand at this new book. What you will find in the book are tools, as we call them, or strategies for rebuilding the way you approach your communication. Like Tool for Rebuilding, each of the tools in this book comes in the form of an axiom. An axiom is a starting point that intends to suggest a basic truth. When employed, that truth, in turn, can determine outcomes. The axioms that we're talking about in this book were shaped over years in the pulpit, in the classroom, during parish meetings and staff workshops. They've been formed before the uninterested and disengaged on confirmation retreats, the eager and excited at vacation Bible school, relaxed and receptive in adult small groups. Caste-driven with worshipers during Mass, the grieving at funerals, and the frightened on the first day of Mass. They've been carefully, painfully, lovingly home. The true believers, the casually committed, sincere skeptics, merely bored. These axioms or tools of ours have also been formed by the successful strategies of some of the healthiest, fastest growing churches that we've found around the country. What we propose is offered with respect for the work you're already doing. And you should know that all of our suggestions work, at least for us, in our setting. By employing these strategies in recent years, we've experienced amazing growth in every measurable way: attendance, giving, service, and mission, to name a few. You probably won't agree with everything we have to say. We know that already. That's okay. If you're a teacher or preacher or pastor or church administrator, if you're a key volunteer or an interested parishioner, you have a role to play in your parish's communication. And that's no minor matter, because the fundamental delivery system for the gospel of Jesus Christ is your local parish church. It all begins with words. And words are just words, that's all they are. At times it can feel as if communicating as a homilist during Mass, a youth minister at a youth retreat, a religious educator during a parents' meeting, a business leader to colleagues. Whatever the form of communication, sometimes it can begin to feel like a waste of time. If you've had to make a presentation to your congregation or club or class, it's hard to capture people's attention. You know that. And it's harder still to keep it. Sometimes we communicators can feel jealous of other professionals who, at the end of the day, have created something they can see and hold and enjoy. After all, we just have words, and like bubbles, they shine in the light for a moment, perhaps, before disappearing into thin air. And yet communication is fundamental to the human experience. It begins at birth. We struggle with it at first and eventually get better, sometimes quite good, but never as good as we want to be, and often not as good as we could be. The message matters, whether it's an infant's cry for food, a teacher's instruction to her class, or the deathbed wishes of a dying man. Even when it seems as if the message doesn't matter, when people are being silly or selfish or perhaps even hateful, they're trying to communicate something, maybe something profoundly important to them. Scripture says, death and life are in the power of the tongue. There's a kind of death that comes from negative or critical words. Recently, we were undertaking an expansion of our parking lot capacity to accommodate parish growth. We carefully pursued all the requisite approvals and permits with the county and the archdiocese. We hosted neighborhood meetings, and then, just as the project got underway, one neighbor made a very emotional appeal to as wide an audience as she could reach, including some very influential leaders in the community. She was upset because the view of our property from her family room would be altered. But small as it was, the proposed project led her to communicate in a way that only served to confuse a lot of people, leading to further miscommunication all around. It felt very unfair to us, and it all happened just because of words. Words can damage and destroy. They can hurt, can kill. On the other hand, words can bring life and growth. We've been incredibly encouraged by the overwhelmingly positive reviews of our books, Rebuilt, and Tools for Rebuilding. Frankly, we were dreading what critics might write, given the strong stance both books take on several controversial topics. And while there's certainly been some pushback, the vast majority of comments have been helpful and encouraging. We've all had experiences wherein words have influenced an outcome, inspired a crowd, or won an election. Each of us has made different choices, set out on new routes, rethought our options, or perhaps even reinvented ourselves because of someone's words. When it comes to money and giving, both Tom and I have experienced changes of heart and subsequently giving patterns because of the preaching of pastors like our friend Rick Warren, who helped us understand what the Bible teaches about money. After learning God's word on the subject, consistently preached by our evangelical friends, we began tithing and taking seriously the stewardship of our own finances. In turn, that message and those words have rebuilt the financial strength of our ministry. There are times when we want to give up, but then someone's words compel us to go on. We easily remember a remarkable evening attending a conference in Atlanta. We had traveled there amidst some difficult circumstances back home, as in incredibly difficult circumstances. We had almost canceled the trip, planned long before, but went anyway, almost as an escape from our troubles. As the conference started, an announcement was made that the promised keynote speaker would not be speaking, and a substitute would be talking on a completely different topic. We'll never forget the message we heard that night from Dr. Charles Stanley, pastor of First Baptist Church of Atlanta. To our astonishment, he described a situation amazingly like our own, and step by step he walked us through what he did in that circumstance. He recounted his own struggles, how he persevered and stayed true to his calling. In an instant, we knew what we had to do. It changed our course. It changed our direction. It changed our lives. And that was all because of words. The message matters. It can change hearts. It can change worlds. It's Winston Churchill in the dark days of World War II, insisting to the people of Britain, we will never give up. It was Mahatma Gandhi teaching colonial India, you must be the change you seek in the world. It was St. John Paul announcing to communist Poland, be not afraid. Just words that changed everything. Communication is about words, but it's also about more than words. Our words are shaped by the context in which they're presented. The environments we create and the actions we take are also forms of communication. And if we fail to pay attention to the setting in which people hear our words, our message could fall on deaf ears. To communicate well, to successfully deliver our messages, our words must work together with our body language, our environment, and the whole of our lives. Unfortunately, in our Catholic culture, communication has sometimes been neglected. At least that's our impression. Somewhere along the way, a lot of church people bought the lie that good preaching and teaching are not worth the energy and effort, that no one expects or needs it. As a result, we've seen lay leaders and ordained alike who never really developed their ability to grow as speakers. We're not criticizing anyone because time and again we've been guilty as charged. Hard to believe, but honestly, for longer than we care to share, we just didn't consider our parish communication all that important. Yet reason, revelation, and our own experience tell us otherwise. Words have power. We know that from Scripture, that God's word has ultimate power. When spoken, his word does not return to him void. It's also true for us. When we use God's word and do it with skill and conviction and certainly with prayer, in a way that honors and serves the word, it will not return to us empty or without effect. The communication that is the fundamental work of our programs and parishes and schools and services can introduce us to God's will, God's plan, and God himself. can inspire and equip us to conform our lives to Christ. In other words, our preaching and teaching are the primary ways in which the church reaches the lost and grows disciples. We offer our thoughts in the context, and I suppose at the very dawn, of what St. John Paul proclaimed, the new evangelization. The new evangelization is the introduction or the reintroduction of the gospel into our culture. The new evangelization is countercultural. You know what? Because it's countercultural, it's a war. You know what else? It's a war of words.
So we'll talk to you with some steps of how to improve the communication of your parish when it comes both word, as Father Michael said, that context in which you work. So a couple steps here, 5 steps to introduce in rebuilding your message at your church. Number 1, you need a plan. Instead, if you fail to plan, you plan to fail. And so we'll talk about that a little bit. Number 2, prepare. That it takes preparation. Whatever you want to communicate, whatever method you want to communicate requires preparation. Number 3, practice. We need to get better at our communication, practicing over and over again. And we're gonna break these down. So we'll come back to these. Number 4, perform. That ultimately communication is, especially a spoken word or is a live presentation that needs to be given. There needs to be a performance aspect to it. And then number 5 is evaluate. So we need to be evaluating our communication. So number 1, how to plan your communication. All these are found in our book in the form of axioms, as Father Michael said. You can find, and you'll find these in our book, Rebuilding Your Message. So number 1, what do you want people to do? Before we can communicate anything, we need to tell people that we need to have clarity of what we're trying to accomplish. What are we trying to get people to do? Right now, we do a thing called Message Series, and I'll talk about that in a little bit, where we take a topic and over a series of weeks, we look at the same topic, and we are doing a series called STEPS. And STEPS is an acronym. It stands for, and it's the 5 ways we think are vital to growing in faith. STEPS stands for serve in ministry and missions, tithe and give, engage in a small group, practice prayer and sacraments, and share your faith. Well, we can clearly communicate that to our parish because we have come to the point where we have a plan for how we want people to grow as disciples of Jesus Christ. So we need to be clear when we're going to be communicating something, what's our plan for people's spiritual growth? What do we want people to do? Another way to plan your communication is through series. We say series are simpler, so I mentioned that earlier a few moments ago. A series is where we take a topic and over a series of weeks keep talking about it to the members of our parish. Now we learned this, and this is how our homilies are done. They are in message series. We learned this from studying other successful, growing, healthy churches, places like Saddleback Church in California, Willow Creek in Chicago, North Point in Atlanta. As we examined these churches that were growing and attracting people, we noticed that they were doing message series. They were taking this topic and over a series of weeks delving into it. And so we began bringing it into our setting. And so it makes it much easier to put together a message or string together your communication. So we use it in all our programs. We use it, again, for our weekend homily, our children's ministry, our youth ministry. They all do message series. And so whatever communication you're in, programs you have running, it does make it simpler to do series, and it creates a natural hook for people to come back. Series are simpler because you don't need to rethink what you're talking about each single week. So you already have a general direction of where things are going. So for pastors or deacons who are preparing messages each week, you don't have to think about what you're speaking about that week. The direction's already been set. We say about series is they help to start a conversation. that the whole point of a message or homily or any spoken presentation or any conversation or any communication should be to start a conversation among parishioners, because conversation eventually leads to conversion. And so because of that, series are more likely to lead to impact and bring about life change. So for example, if you are talking about service, a lot of the readings this past few weeks have been about service. If you talk 1 week about service, the conversation kind of dies after that first week if you're able to accomplish that. But if whether communicating to students or children or the whole parish, adults, you take service and over a series of weeks talk about that, it's more likely to get the people engaged in that conversation and to move people on the path of life change. And it's also very helpful for us as a church because we are planning our communication. Every April, we have some members of our team, Father Michael, myself, some other key staff members, and we go away and we brainstorm, what does our church need to hear about this year? What are some topics we need to delve into in the year ahead? Where is the lectionary leading us? And we plan out our message series from September through mid-June. So it is a great way to help you plan your communication is through a series. Number 3, when it comes to plan your communication, timing is everything. That you want to plan your communication so that it's in sync with the seasons of the year. So right now it's fall, obviously. Beginning of weekend after Labor Day, at least in our community, people are back at school. We do something that's kind of kick off. The kids are back from school. People are back from vacation. There's kind of a new beginning happening. That's where we launch something, a kind of exciting brand message series. That's in the fall. Obviously, then leads into Advent time. What are you communicating at Advent? Thanksgiving and Advent. Thanksgiving, Advent's a very rich time for getting people to give. People are in a giving mode. That's one of us reasons we do our Stewardship Sunday, the Sunday before Thanksgiving, because people are getting into a giving mode. Obviously, Advent, people are getting ready for Christmas. So our communication, we want to reflect that time, that time of year, and that feel of Christmas, so to speak. January, that's again, people have that kind of New Year feel again. It's obviously a brand new calendar year. People are making New Year's resolutions. Again, that's a great time to capitalize on that kind of feeling that's out in the culture. For us in February, we often do what we call a relational series, and that's because you have Valentine's Day, and Hallmark is selling cards, and so that's what's in the culture at that point of year. So we try to capitalize on that. Then you go into Lent and your pre-Easter time, and for us, we find that's a great time of year when attendance swells. So you want to be capitalizing that you have a larger group of people coming to you probably than any other time of year during Lent. And so you want to capitalize on that. Usually for us, series-wise, it's like a tough series or it's a discipleship series, kind of challenging people. So for example, this year coming up, we're going to talk about humility. Very easy topic to cover. So that's Lent, and you get your Easter time. There's an opportunity there to reach new people. So your communication wants to be thinking about how are we getting new people to come to church for Easter Sunday. How do we try to sustain that through the people who come for Easter Sunday are going to want to keep coming and being attentive, especially to new people who are joining the church, maybe coming back to church for the first time. There's an opportunity there. And then the post-Easter into summer, usually the later spring, attendance is dying down at a church. There's going to be a different feel of what you want to communicate at that time. And then summer, obviously lower numbers across the churches. And so our communication then is going to be a little different as well. So timing is everything. And when it comes to planning your communication, what I would suggest is kind of looking at your communication along the seasons, from fall into Christmas, Thanksgiving and Advent, Christmas season, to the New Year, into Lent, and then into Easter / post-Easter, and then late spring into summer. Think about your communication plan in sense of those seasons, because timing is everything. So you want to plan your communication. Number two, we need to prepare. Preparation shines through. It's one of our axioms in the book, that if you prepare for something, it will naturally come through. I remember hearing about Peter Jackson and building the sets for Lord of the Rings movies when they were out, and the detail they put into painting scenery and painting things that weren't even going to appear on the screen possibly, and they put that preparation in because they kind of knew it would impact the rest of the movie, because preparation and effort, that just shines through. So when it comes to a spoken presentation, how much preparation should you give? Well, Rick Warren says he prepares about 16 hours a week for a homily. Perry Noble, who's a pastor of New Spring Church in South Carolina, he prepares every minute he speaks, he prepares an hour for it. That's his rule of thumb. Father Michael says about 10 hours a week. The point, the point is not how much to tell you that those times, to say that's how long you should prepare, but to look at your schedule and see how can you invest more time into preparation. Or another way is to say, what does a presentation call for? Some presentations, they can be very small, but they're a great impact. I had about a quick 5-minute presentation to make this past April for some major givers in our church, and I practiced hours for that. I poured over that talk because I know it was a seminal moment in our church, and so even though it was a very short talk, I needed to be very crisp on it. Other times things are more conversational. It could even be longer, but not take as much effort to prepare for it. But make sure you prepare, because preparation shines through. Another way you prepare is, first you got to live it. If you're speaking to children or students or writing something to communicate about, to tell people how to live, make sure you live it first. Speak from your experience in some way. I mentioned this anecdote in the book, Rebuilding Your Message, that I was having this meeting, and it was just kind of bringing together some other parishes, just to talk about their experiences, and we were just sharing. It was the first time that they had ever met, and one pastor was sharing how his church was bilingual and some of the struggles of that. It was amazing to me how quickly the other guys at the table, other people, members of the table, were quick to give advice on it. But then when you kind of ask, well, do any of you have a bilingual church, or do any of you face that? They're like, no, I don't have that. I'm like, what is it in the Catholic Church that we sometimes feel like we have to give advice to people even though we have no experience with it? So we don't want to be speaking out of ignorance, but out of our lived experience, and that's part of preparation as a communicator. So before you speak on a topic, or before you write on a topic, or communicate anything about a topic, reflect on your own experience. How does that intersect with the material you're presenting? Challenge people from your experience, so that you can say, here's how it's worked in my life, or here's the experiences I have. Now, to say to first live it does not mean you have to be an expert by any stretch of the imagination. It doesn't mean you have to have it all figured out and live it perfectly. In fact, you can be just a little bit ahead. I remember hearing a message from Doug Fields, who was the youth pastor at Saddleback Church, but he was actually delivering this message to the whole church of Saddleback. And they were talking about busyness and being overly busy, and the series was called Simplify Your Life. And it's like, hey, I just want to acknowledge I struggle with this too. I'm just a little bit out ahead of you. And I just thought that was a great way for authenticity to shine through, but he lived it. He was trying to put it into practice first. And I knew he was speaking from some experience, though he was acknowledging he struggled with it. So even if we're a day ahead of people, an hour ahead of people in our experience, before we communicate anything on how to live or how to practice the gospel or what we want them to do, we need to make sure we first live it out, at least in some way. And again, it is okay if you struggle with something or haven't mastered it. If we had to all wait until we were perfect to share anything with other people, we would never share anything, right? We would never communicate anything. And so It's okay if you struggle with it. Be honest with people in your communication when you struggle with it. And as we say in our book, this is another axiom from Rebuilding Your Message. If you speak out of your weaknesses, you'll never run out of things to say. If you speak from your weakness, you'll never run out of things to say. And if you're working on growing, you'll never run out of things to say. So prepare by living it. Also, you can prepare by letting your message marinate. This is kind of a theme today. This word's come up a few times in my day today. I like to grill, and I like the charcoal grill. Don't use the gas grill, old-fashioned charcoal. But anything, I have, and one of my favorite books I have to help me with that is Weber's book on grilling. And some of the best recipes are marinades. And marinades are great because usually with just a little bit of effort, right, you mix it, if you're a cook, a chef, if you like the barbecue, you know, you make a marinade up, and you can make it up in a few minutes. You soak the meat or you soak whatever you're cooking in that marinade, and it can bring a whole bunch of flavor with just a little bit of effort. By the way, my favorite marinade actually is a really quick one, simple salmon marinade from that Weber's Grill. Just had it last night. Awesome. Simple salmon marinade. Great. But in any case, my point is this. If you let your messages and communication marinate in your head for a while, it will make your communication and the communication of your church so much better. So this goes back to what we talked about that first step, a plan. Plan long term. Think ahead about what you're going to want to be communicating, especially based on the seasons of the year, the cycle of the year that we experience. Again, for us, as I mentioned earlier, that means we plan our message series in April. So we plan in April what will happen in September that year through June of the following year. And that just allows material to marinate. It allows us to be thinking about ideas. So if I know, as I mentioned, we're going to talk about humility, I'm on the lookout for quotes about humility. I can think about that. If there's books on the topic, it helps it just helps put your antenna up for different ideas that will help serve your communication. Again, so this also means we're always on the lookout for material. Also, when it comes to let your message marinate, the earlier you can prepare, the better. And again, sometimes we're limited by that, but whatever, as much as you possibly can, do not cram for your communication. Do not cram. Do not procrastinate. See, because you cram and you procrastinate, you're not as relaxed. But when you let the message marinate, the earlier you prepare, if you have to give a presentation in a couple of weeks and you just think about that, do some study on, reflect on that, and give yourself even just a little bit of time, a half hour, the message is going to marinate in your head, and it'll come off so much more easier. Be so much more. You'll put the presentation together so much more easily if you let the message marinate. And then number 4 here under prepare, find your burden. Find your burden. This is a term I learned from Andy Stanley, who's pastor at North Point. And Andy, his father, as Father Michael mentioned earlier, his father is Charles Stanley, who was also a preacher. And Andy, in hearing Andy talk about messages and how to present, he said that a couple of times once he was with his father, and they were listening to this preacher talk. And his father leaned over and said to Andy, "That guy doesn't have a burden." And what he means by that, and so we say find your burden. Your burden is what you have to say. It's what you have to get off your chest, right? The burden is that thought, that insight, that life lesson that you absolutely have to share with people. Like it's dying to come out from you. And if you don't have a burden in your communication, or if you don't have a burden in your speaking, or again, your communication, whatever form it's taking, then you haven't prepared enough yet, or you're not speaking on the right topic. Preparation requires us to find our burden. For me, how do I find my burden? Well, for me, it especially comes through reading Scripture. That for me, it just comes from reading the Scripture and reading a passage I want to present on. And as I read it, I keep reading it over and over again until I find that one verse that is the crux of everything I want to communicate. It's like, yes, That's what I want them to know. Like, that's the verse I want them to walk out with. That's the verse that's carrying this whole message or whole presentation. So, for example, not too long ago, I did a presentation for our church on Elijah. And if you remember the story of Elijah, Elijah comes forth and he commands, because of God's command, he tells the rain to stop. And because King Ahab is just a terrible king, leading the people astray from worshiping God, and so Elijah commands the rain to stop. And then he goes away for a few years. And then and God takes care of him through the widow of Zarephath and through other means, amazing means. And eventually Elijah comes back and he challenges the prophets of Baal, who all the people are worshiping, to a kind of contest to see who's the real God. And then there's this contest asking God, they're each going to call out to their God. The prophets of Baal are going to call out to their God, and Elijah's going to call out to his God, to God, to Yahweh, to the Lord. And obviously, when the prophets of Baal go and they fail, Elijah prays, and the fire comes and consumes the sacrifice, and everyone comes back to worship God. But then, right after that, Elijah's life is threatened by the evil queen Jezebel, and he runs away, and he wants to give up, and he wants to quit. And so my message is about, how do you know when it's time to quit? How do you know when it's time to give up? And I set that up, and then I went through the story, and I went to this one verse, these two words that God says, that how do you know when it's time to quit? And what God says to Elijah is, go back. Go back. And those were the words I kind of hung the message on. And I said, you know what, here's when you should quit. You should, and I connected to a lived experience of myself that I had as well. Here's when you should quit. You quit when God tells you to quit. You give up when God says it's time to give up. But more often than not, when you feel like giving up on something important in your life, what you're going to hear from God is, go back. So you find the burden through Scripture, or maybe you can find the burden through those real life consequences. So when I was giving that message on Elijah, I thought, what if I had given up? What if I had quit? And there's probably some people that are listening to this message today, and they're ready to quit, or they're ready to quit on a work environment, or they're ready to quit on something that's incredibly important, and I don't want them to quit. And I'm speaking to that person today, and that helped me to find my burden. So consider the real-life consequences if your message is not heard, and that will help you find the burden. And final way on finding the burden is to practice the message out loud. I'm going to talk about this in a few minutes, of speaking the message into life, and that'll help you find your burden, because usually when you speak and talk, again, through at least a spoken presentation, an oral presentation, that begins to reveal the heart. Jesus said that out of the heart, our words are spoken out of our heart, and speaking sometimes can reveal our burden. I'm sorry, the final one for preparation is prepare your context. Prepare your context. And so I'm not going to talk too much about this right now in this presentation, but one of the things that Rebuilding Your Message we address is, what's the context for Sunday morning at your church, or Saturday evening, or when people come to Mass, what's the context look like? And you can prepare the context. So for us, that's important, about a context of hospitality. So we have parking ministers and greeters at the door, and information desk ministers, and what we call the host team ministers, that are trying to create an environment that's relaxed and welcoming and accessible, and that's going to make it easier for people to hear Father Michael's homily. The setting in which you make a presentation is so important. We don't always have control over that, but if you're at a church, you have a lot of control over that. If you're speaking there week after week, or what's your youth room look like? What's the context and environment look like? The environment will impact how people hear your message. I remember one preacher that I was listening to on communication said that he had the opportunity to speak to like tens of thousands of young people, and he really looked forward to hearing it. But it was outside at a amusement park, and so he did it for a few years. But what would happen was he'd be trying to speak, and there was a roller coaster behind him, and so the group, there's tens of thousands of students, but all they're hearing is and he's like, that was not a great environment to communicate the gospel. So as parishes, we can prepare our context. We can make our places look clean and neat and simple, and we can prepare it by having ministers create a great environment, prepare your context, and again, a lot more in depth on that in rebuilding your message. It's next step. So plan, prepare, practice. Plan, prepare, practice. Oops, sorry, hold on a second here. Practice. So, was it Allen Iverson? Practice. We're talking about practice. We're talking about practice. And we want to practice more than you play. Malcolm Gladwell wrote a book called Outliers, and it was what makes somebody successful. And as they studied people who were successful in what they did, whether it was the Beatles with music or Bill Gates with Microsoft and computers, they found that people practice 10,000 hours to become kind of world-class professionals. And maybe you don't have 10,000 hours to invest, but you can start working towards that time. And so when it comes to writing, if you're a writer, anytime you write and work on communicating through writing, you are practicing. As a speaker, anytime we get up and practice our our message, we are getting better at what we do and making the message more effective. So practice more than you play. Professional athletes, that's what they do, right? We watch a football game and they play 60 minutes, but they devote hours and hours and hours to that. Watch a baseball player hit a ball and they make it look effortless, don't they? Ever stood in front of a 90-mile-an-hour fastball? It comes in pretty fast, and yet these guys can hit it. I probably couldn't even see it, but they can hit it because they practice more than they play. So how can you apply this? Identify the time and a place. A time and a place. Where are you going to practice your communication? Where are you going to grow in that skill? Is that going to be, if it's writing, where are you going to set the time and the place to write? If it's practicing a message or a talk, where's the time and a place? You need both. Put it in your schedule and identify the place where you can get away from people and get away from distractions. And know this, you're going to have to fight for it. When it comes to practicing and getting better at communicating, the world, the flesh, and the devil will all conspire against us. The world, because people will come in and try to distract you. They'll want your time. The flesh, something in us, not want to do it. We'll want to find something else to do and distract ourselves. And then, of course, the devil, just the evil one, will want to come against us as well. So practice more than you play. Number two, when it comes to practice, these are other axioms throughout rebuilding your message that you can read at your leisure. But presentation trumps content. Here's what we mean by that. The reason we need to practice is because how you present something is as important or even more important than what you are communicating. So the example we use in a book is a message we had heard from someone who said he was driving in his car and he saw this woman, her car was on fire. And so another guy got out of the car and starts waving to her to let her know, but she didn't know her car was on fire. So she looks over and she sees this guy running at her, and she's scared to death, and so she tries to drive off even though her car's on fire. And because the presentation trumped the content, she was certainly interested in the content. Anyone wants to know if their car's on fire. But because this guy came running at her in a way that seemed threatening to her, she wasn't able to listen. So our presentation trumps content, because if people cannot listen to what we're saying, then it doesn't matter what we're saying. So this is not saying content is unimportant, but if we want people to listen to us and apply us, we need to work on the presentation. And that goes, if you do not practice the presentation, then your message will not get heard no matter how good it is if it's not presented well. Another way we like to say this is speak life into the message. So I mentioned earlier that speaking a message out loud, obviously if it's an oral presentation, is going to help you find your burden, but it's obviously also helping you to practice what you're going to say. And at least I find that it gets my synapses connecting in a better way when I practice a message and when I speak it outside, speak it into life, that it helps me find things I didn't know were there, or I'll be like, oh, that's what I wanted to say. So speak the message into life. Speak it out loud. Number 4, so we talked about plan, prepare, practice, perform. That in some way, especially oral presentations, are eventually going to be some kind of performance, and we have to do it. Or if it's a written communication or any kind of other form of communication, we eventually have to perform it, have to actually do it. And so a couple of thoughts, especially on spoken presentations. Look to make them laugh and make them cry. So as you perform it, look for opportunities to do that. Laughter and tears help us to connect us to other people. It helps to form an emotional connection, which is very important when it comes to changing lives or making an impact. Laughter is we would say at our church, we make them laugh a lot more than we make them cry. Sometimes, some of the homilies we hear, we could maybe cry because of their quality. But here, we're saying more often than not, we want to make them laugh, because when people laugh, they relax. When people relax, they listen. So how do you do that? Well, number 1, how do you make people laugh? One, just pay attention to how you make others laugh in everyday conversations. What kind of sense of humor do you have? I have a kind of dry sense of humor. That's my sense of humor. And kind of even go back to that speaking a message into life. Often I don't write although I write messages I'm going to present, I often don't find the humor until I start to speak it into life. I'm like, oh, that's funny. There's an opportunity for a joke. And again, it goes to my sense of humor, which is often a little, I guess dry would be the best way to state it, or understated is another way. That's my sense of humor. You might be sarcastic. You might Father Michael tells stories, and he kind of blows them up a bit, and kind of he exaggerates on them. I was not going to say exaggerates, but he used that word, so I'll go with that. It depends on some people are storytellers, and they find the humor in the story. Whatever is your sense of humor, use that. Humor flows best out of who we are. And then to make them cry is that, I think when we acknowledge the gap between who we are and who we want to be. That's why Jesus said, blessed are those who mourn, they shall be comforted, that we mourn over that sometimes. Or I think most times what we want to, or when we tap into people's highest values, Mother's Day, that can kind of tap in because everyone values their mother and values motherhood. Also, I would say this, when we ask people to call on their better angels, our highest ideals, things like honor and patriotism and love of country and love of family, those are at times opportunities where, again, not all the time, but once in a while, you want that in your arsenal. Make them laugh. Make them cry. Another thing in your performance to look for are tell stories. Stories stick. Stories stick. In fact, it's been found, excuse me a second. Stories hold our attention. They get, and in rebuilding our message, Father Michael tells a story or experience of sitting at home reading the paper. So what he does is go home, reads the paper, puts the TV on, builds a fire or has a fireplace he puts on, gas fireplace, and one night he was just sitting by the fire reading the paper, kind of had the TV on the background, and there was a preacher on there, and he wasn't really paying attention to the preacher until all of a sudden he noticed he was telling a story. And then he put the paper down and listened. My kids, they want stories every night, and sometimes I think it's just because they want to put off going to bed, but I think they do really want a story. They like hearing a story before bed because we like stories. We listen to stories. And stories engage us beyond just listening. They engage us in an active manner. That there's been some research that shows that when you're hearing a story, you're not just passive. It's not just entertainment, but you're putting yourself in the story. You're active. Well, how would I reacted? How would I have responded? And so looking for stories to Either this is very important when it comes to our performance. Also, so look for stories of Scripture. We say this, another axiom we have in the book is tell the story behind the story. That there are so many opportunities to tell stories from Scriptures because many Catholics are largely ignorant of it. And so, is there a story behind the passage you're going to be talking about that is helpful to people? Look for stories from your own life. Write them down. When you have something interesting to you that you just can't wait to go home and share with somebody else, well, do that, but then go and write it down and then kind of archive that or save that. So, okay, I'm going to use that story later. I had one story that I used, and I just wrote. It happened to me, and I didn't know how I was going to use it. One night, it was a couple of years ago in November. I promised to take my kids camping. I'm not really a camper, and so anyway, I promised to take them camping, and it was November, and I was just going to kind of do a quick one-night thing, and I was going to go to one of the local places in Maryland, campground. And I found a state campground, and I got there and I found out that the campgrounds are closed in November. They shut them down, and I had to work the next day, so I really couldn't take them very far. I had to come back to the church later the next day, but later in the morning. So in any case, I said, all right, how about we camp out overnight at the house? We'll put the tent outside. We'll build a fire. We'll make s'mores, and the best I could do. So they agreed to that. So we did that. So it's 10 o'clock at night. I was going to have my 3 older boys who are at the time come sleep in the tent with me. Well, so then I have 7 kids, and so then the 2 of the younger ones wanted to sleep in the tent as well. And so one son was 3 at the time. His name is Kefa. And he wanted to sleep in the tent, and I said, oh, okay, that's great. My wife, me, is like, you sure that's going to be all right? I'm like, oh, it'll be fine. Well, my Kefa comes in, and he's sleeping, so we go to bed at like 10 o'clock at night, and some time goes by, I fall asleep, and the next thing I know, there's somebody outside my tent, and I'm kind of like, oh my gosh, what is this? And it zips up, and it's my wife. And I'm like, what's going on? And she says, Kefa's crying. And my wife heard Kefa crying from upstairs in our house. She was not in the tent. She had heard him from upstairs and came down and heard him crying, and he was about 3 minutes, he was about 3 feet from me. And so I saved that story and I shared it. I said, sometimes with prayer it can feel like God doesn't hear us. And yet, that God's ignoring us. My wife heard Kefa from her son all the way in the house, and I couldn't hear him from a few feet away, and is God like that? And I kind of use that to introduce something about prayer. So look out for story, but that happened to me in November. I didn't share that story till March, so write down stories that happened to you and save for later. Again, look for stories from your own life. Tell other people's stories. If you get emails or letters you receive from other people, tell those stories. And then for some of you, and this depends upon your presentation, but get into the character. Some of you, again, probably have skills and abilities where you could mimic the voice or kind of imitate the body language or imitate the body language of people. You see that with comedians all the time. But tell stories and get into character. And the next one, for perform, you can create tension through silence. Look for opportunities to create tension through silence. Tension is incredibly important when it comes to communicating a spoken presentation, an oral presentation. Tension, and that can also be used in written communication as well, but tension gets people to lean in. Tension makes people want to listen and find out the answer. And so, going back to that Elijah message, so I say, how do you know when it's time to quit? How do you know when it's time to give up on a situation? Well, man, that's something we all are going to face at some point. I want to know the answer to that. I want to hear the answer to that. Well, you set up the question, then you wait. Or you can create tension through silence. So for that message from Elijah, I said, so what do you think God said to Elijah? And I paused. And then I said, I said, he said, back. And so that tension, what do you think God said? I don't know. And that silence for just a second creates interest and tension. So when you give a presentation, look for opportunities to pause or to be quiet before you give an answer, or so you can create that tension. So we talked about plan, we talked about practice, we talked about perform and prepare, and now we want to talk about evaluate, final thing. So evaluate. So how do you evaluate yourself? Number one, the best way to evaluate yourself as a speaker is to watch yourself or to listen to yourself. So you can, we videotape our messages on the weekend, our homilies, and so we can watch them. And I watch small group videos. It's very painful. I sit in my small group and I watch the small group presentation I did. It hurts to hear your own voice. It hurts to watch yourself, but you will learn a great deal about yourself if you watch yourself or if you listen to yourself. I have this tendency to dance, like shift my weight from one to the left foot to the right, right to the left. I call it dancing. I'm actually not that good a dancer, but I kind of dance in the message, and I learned that I did that by just watching myself, and I've gotten much better at just standing firm and delivering a message because I watched myself. So it's painful, but it's the number one way you can get better at presenting. To be dynamic, another way is to be dynamic. You've got to be specific. So evaluate, am I being specific enough? What do I want them to know? What do I want them to do? Was the message concrete or vague? Again, if it's vague, then people don't have to do anything with it. So, for example, and you want to try to get specific within a message or presentation or communication. You don't want to just say, all right, don't sin. You want to say, hey, this week, let's not gossip about the people in our lives. Or you don't want to say, hey, give to God. You want to say, hey, here's a great opportunity for God. You can sign up for our electronic funds transfer. Or, don't just say, oh, you should be praying. But how about pray 10? Or pray 10 by reading the Bible. Pray 10 by reading these passages this week. Get very specific so it gets dynamic. So evaluate yourself. Am I giving specifics enough? And then last, we would say another way to help evaluate yourself, and there's others in the book, Rebuilding Your Message, but are you comforting outsiders and challenging insiders? So often in the church, what we do in our presentations or our communication is we comfort the insiders. The people are already in our church, and we challenge outsiders, and we want them to be like us. We want to be evaluating our communication. No, it should be comforting outsiders, saying, hey, we're glad you're here, we're glad you're a part of it, and challenging the insiders to move. That's what Jesus did. He comforted outsiders. He comforted the woman who was caught in adultery. He comforted the woman at the well. It was mostly comfort. There was a little bit of challenge, whereas the Pharisees and religious leaders, there was a whole lot of challenge and very little comfort. So evaluate your communication when it comes to that. So plan, prepare, practice, perform, and evaluate your communication, and you will improve it. You'll be rebuilding your message. And so obviously these things are not like a one-time thing. It's doing them over and over and over again. And so Jared, that ends up on our end. We got questions.
Yeah, sounds great. Thank you, Tom and Father Michael. We're going to switch things back over here just so people can see the question section. We're about out of time. It's about almost 4 o'clock right now. So if anyone wants to jump in with a question, that would be great. You can. We'll see if we can answer one or two here real quickly. But if we don't get to the questions that you're jumping in and asking right now, Tom does a bi-weekly podcast, right? Tom, is that right? Every 2 weeks?
Yes, every 2 weeks. Yeah, Chris and I.
Yeah, Chris Wesley and Tom Corcoran do a podcast every 2 weeks. So if you have a question that you want to ask, I'll make sure and send those to you, Tom, and you can answer some of them on the podcast at some point throughout this year. But go ahead and jump in and ask questions if you want to before we finish up. We have a question from Marcy who asked at the very beginning. She wanted to know about recruiting volunteers. How would you what kind of, again, related to communication, what kind of messages or what communication strategies would you use to get volunteers recruited to help out?
Jared, we feel like we've really cracked the code when it comes to recruiting volunteers. we have this secret formula. We just go ahead and ask them.
So I like to say, Jared, too, is how you ask is important. So painting a vision of what you think volunteering will accomplish in their lives and the lives of others. So when you ask them, though, don't just say, please, 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 we need volunteers, but, hey, we need volunteers to invest in the students of our parish. And when you invest, you're going to grow in your own faith, and you're going to make the difference in the life of a young person in our parish. So paint the vision of what it will accomplish when you ask them.
I like that. So first tip is there. Don't make sure you're actually asking them, and then secondly, make sure when you do, it's not a kind of a pity party. You're making sure you're showing the positive aspects of volunteering and helping out the parish.
Yeah, or even more broadly, connected to the vision and the mission is what you're asking them to do, connected to the greater goal.
Good. We have a question from Sharon. She asked, how do you get staff members on board with that annual communication planning?
Yeah, I think obviously it would start with the different people you want involved in that. So if you want to the pastor, if you can do that, or whoever the key people is, but the director of communications, whoever kind of is driving the communications through the church, would identify the key people. One of the things we do that, so for example, we have announcements and we say what's coming up for that series, that time of year, that you want communicated, and then, but that's not the end of it. We sift through it after that. So, it's a great question because we're kind of in a rhythm now. That rhythm I talked about, we've gotten there. That's kind of in the back of our heads all the time. So the message series really helps us with that.
Angela's asking. Go ahead. Anything to say, Michael? Father Michael? Sorry. We have a question from Angela, so I'm going to jump in with hers real quickly. She's asking about teamwork, and I know that you all do this really well in your parish at Nativity. She says, what's your recommendation for helping a team work together? How can you help build trust amongst team members?
We've really been helped by Patrick Lencioni's 5 Dysfunctions of a Team. I would recommend that as a resource. And the other thing Patrick's really big on in that book is kind of Myers-Briggs or some other personality test as a reference to begin understanding where people are coming from. My quick recommendations. Michael? Yeah.
The more you can learn about one another's personalities, the more it's going to help in terms of understanding and open the door to better communication. And better communication, proper communication is fundamental to trust. You're just not going to have trust on your team if you don't have communication. And if you don't have trust, then lots of other bad things creep in.
One other just resource would be Trust versus Suspicion by Andy Stanley. It's a video.
Awesome. Well, good. I don't want to take up too much of your time, the two of you presenting, and then also anybody else. Thank you so much for being here. It's a little bit after 4, so we're going to wrap things up. But like I said, we'll be sending out the recording, and I'll be sending Tom any of the questions we have that are unanswered, and you can address those in the podcast. Real quickly, we've been talking about the book Rebuilding Your Message, which of course is available to anybody participating in this webinar for 20% off. So if you want to go ahead and access that on the Ave Maria Press website, you can use that promo code webinar 10/6, which is the date today, until next Tuesday, so 1 week from today. I want to shout out to our partners in the series and thank them for being the supporters and promoters of the webinar series: the National Conference for Catechetical Leadership, the National Association for Lay Ministry, and the National Federation of Priest Councils. If you're not familiar with them, go ahead and check out their organizations on their website. Feel free to connect with Ave Maria Press on various social media networks. We'll be having the recording of this webinar, especially on YouTube and Vimeo, and you can find that at avemariapress.com/webinar-videos. The recording of this and all the webinars we've done since 2010 will be posted there, or are posted there on our website. Real quickly, for next week, not next week, but the October 27th will be the next webinar, and we'll be welcoming Ted Miles from Catholic Relief Services. He'll be talking about the Pope's recent encyclical Laudato Si, and he'll be giving some of the highlights and the core themes of the encyclical, especially when it relates to some of the most needy in our world, in our country, and introduce participants to some resources to help foster a dialogue and faith-filled engagement in this core issue in our church today. So come back again in few weeks from now on October 27th for that presentation about Laudato Si. Tom and Father Michael, thanks again for being with us and sharing some of your insights into communication. We really appreciate everything you do for all the Catholic churches here in the country and throughout the world.
Thanks, Jared.
Okay. Take care, everybody.